All right, it's 12 o'clock, so I'm thinking just to be mindful of everyone's time. I know the lunch hour goes by quickly. That we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll just quickly introduce myself, and then I'll kind of be muted in the background. I'm Sarah Dorner, and I am the Associate Director of Admissions and International Outreach at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. And so I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We apologize that we weren't able to offer this workshop at the conference the other week, but are glad that you were able to join us today. So thank you. And I'll introduce Professor Scherr, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Professor Buzz Scherr. Formerly, my name is Albert Scherr, but nobody calls me Albert. Everybody calls me Buzz. I'm a professor of law and also chair of the International Criminal Law and Justice Program here at UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law. My apologies again for having to cancel the live presentation. I came down with a case of pneumonia and thought it best that I not try and make the live presentation. So let me give you some basics up front. There's a chat feature to this webinar, and the way we're going to run it is if you have a question, even during the presentation, just fill out the question on the chat feature and send it in, and Sarah will ask me the question. I have no problem doing it in mid-presentation, and again, there'll be time at the end for more questions if you wish. I will point out also that this presentation is being recorded, so I just want you all aware of that. This presentation is part of the International Criminal Law and Justice Program here at UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law. The program is what I would call a transnational crime program. It offers a master's or an LLM degree for those of you who already have a law degree, completely online and asynchronously. That is, you don't have to be online at the same time your professor is. We offer the master's or the LLM in a full-time mode or a part-time mode. Excuse me, I've put in the link to the program if this is something that interests you. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Also, late last week, I recorded a podcast on a related topic. This is an area, cyber attacks, and cybercrime and cyber war is an area of research interest of mine, and I recorded a podcast last week available at the link pasted in here that is, when does a cyber attack count as a declaration of war? As we've been hearing even very recently, there's been more and more cyber attacks. The U.S. launched a cyber attack on the country of Iran last week. We have embedded cyber attack capability, it appears, in the power grid of Russia, and there have been attacks on our power grid, and we'll talk about that. So the subject of that podcast is, at what point does a cyber attack constitute a declaration of war? It's something that experts are only beginning to think about, and this podcast addresses that topic in general. All right, so now to the core of this. This is in terms of emergency preparedness focus. This presentation is designed to offer a front-end assessment of what you need to know as you think about cyber attacks and emergency preparedness. And I'm going to cover four things. One, you need to know that cyber attacks are happening and they're state-sponsored and they're intentionally destructive. Cyber attacks are happening, among other things, on infrastructure. In many ways, it's the most common kind of cyber attack on a variety of types of infrastructure, private and public. Third, we are constantly improving our cybersecurity efforts, but inevitably the very nature of cybersecurity is that we're always ready for the attack that just occurred. It's hard to keep pace with the cyber attack that is coming in the future because it's like a virus. A virus evolves as defenses are put up. And that's what happens with cyber attacks. They evolve once a defense is put up. So we're always going to be lagging behind. And finally, kind of the most important point here, that the potential damage from a cyber attack on the power grid infrastructure in the United States is fundamentally different than other kinds of disasters that we are much more prepared for, particularly natural disasters, both in scope, in duration, in intentionality, and unpredictability. So that's going to be our focus. I hope to give us, to be done with this in another half an hour or so there'll be time for more questions. But feel free to ask questions as we're going along. So, a quick review of the cyber attacks that are happening in the last 10 years or so. Article in the New York Times several years ago, when Obama first came into office, he secretly ordered sophisticated attacks on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. Basically a cyber attack on the country of Iran. These were attacks that were occurring in the George W. Bush administration, but President Obama accelerated them. And in the summer of 2010, there was an attack. And the worm that was developed was called Stuxnet. Some of you may have heard of that. So that's one of the earlier infrastructure attacks. In 2016, the Justice Department indicted 7 computer specialists who regularly work for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, charging that they carried out cyber attacks on dozens of American banks and tried to take over the controls of a small dam in a suburb of New York. 2 different infrastructure attacks on private infrastructure, American banks, and loosely a small public infrastructure attack, an effort to take over the controls of a dam. So that happened back in 2016. 2013, an unauthorized user from China is documented as hacking into the Corps of Engineers' National Inventory of Dams, a database of information on the vulnerabilities of major dams in the United States. A not insignificant source of infrastructure information. The database contained categories of dams based on the number of people that would be killed if the particular dam failed. Now, note the adjective associated with the word evidence. There's no public evidence that exists that the Chinese government was involved. That's the current state of knowledge. There's no public evidence. We don't know what the US military, the other aspects of the US government knows. But again, this is a pretty significant incursion, if not on infrastructure capability, on infrastructure, more intimate infrastructure knowledge. Back in 2014, BAE Systems reported that a cyber espionage toolkit known as Snake or Ouroboros had been found on the government computer networks of the Ukraine. The malware gave the hackers full remote access to the system, thereby enabling surveillance and data theft. This is a direct attack, malware attack by hackers on the government infrastructure, the government computer networks of a country. There was certainly a lot of suspicion that the hackers were Russian. There was similar evidence found in systems in Lithuania, Britain, Georgia. Again, no public information that the Russian government was all involved in the hacking, but it occurred at the same time that there was Russian-inspired unrest in the Ukraine. In 2015, the then president of Ukraine reported that there were 6,500 cyber attacks on 36 Ukrainian targets in 2 months. The cybersecurity analysts couldn't conclusively say that it was the Kremlin who was making the attacks, but the president of Ukraine said, the evidence pointed to direct or indirect involvement of secret services of Russia, which unleashed a cyber war against our country. Note what's going on here. This is the use of cyber weapons and cyber attacks as a part of international relations, the unraveling of international relations between countries. Certainly at the time all of this was going on, there was a lot of hostility back and forth between the democratically elected government of Ukraine and the country of Russia. And these cyber attacks on infrastructure were a manifestation of those hostilities. Now, and that explains this site. However, the president of the Ukraine thought that this was about destabilizing the situation in the Ukraine to make the government look less than capable. And this was combined with disinformation flooding the Ukrainian media, terrorist campaigns in the east of the country, the fact that the president, who had been president from 2005 to 2010, had been poisoned several years ago. And so this is the Ukrainians believed that this was a manifestation of this ongoing hostilities between the two countries. By the same token, a number of cybersecurity analysts around the country thought that this was evidence of something more, and in addition, that Russia was using Ukraine as a cyber war testing ground, a laboratory for perfecting new forms of global online combat. And that, to quote here, the digital explosives that Russia had repeatedly set off in the Ukraine are ones it has planted at least once before in the civil infrastructure of the United States. Notice that phrase, that very provocative phrase, the digital explosives, because that's what this is. These things are. So these attacks are intentionally destructive. They're not by accident. For example, the most well-known cyber attack was the Russian hacking during the 2016 presidential election, where Russia purchased ads on YouTube, Gmail, and other platforms. They had significant fake presence on Twitter, and through a direct hacking attack, they acquired emails from both the Democratic and Republican parties, some of which, the Democratic ones, were published through WikiLeaks. And in fact, they hacked into the election mechanisms in several states and counties around the United States. Several years, a year or two after the 2016 presidential election, there was a joint intelligence report published by the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI, and I'm quoting now from that joint intelligence report, which were findings that those three agencies made. We assess with high confidence that Russian military intelligence used the Guccifer 2.0 persona and DCleaks.com, aka WikiLeaks, to release U.S. victim data obtained in cyber operations publicly and in exclusives to media outlets, and relayed materials to WikiLeaks. Russian intelligence obtained and maintained access to elements of multiple U.S. state or local electoral boards. Department of Homeland Security assesses that the type of systems Russian actors targeted or compromised were not involved in vote tallying. We assess Moscow will apply lessons learned from its Putin-ordered campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election to future influence efforts worldwide, including against U.S. allies, etc. We also assess Russian intelligence services collected against the U.S. primary campaigns, think tanks, and lobbying groups they viewed as likely to shape future U.S. policies. This goes on to talk about the access to the Democratic Party emails, then their public disclosure using DC Leaks and WikiLeaks. Long and short of it was, this is a very sophisticated, coordinated, intentionally destructive campaign. As to the state and local electoral boards, Russian intelligence accessed elements of multiple state or local electoral boards. Since 2014, Russian intelligence has researched electoral processes and related technology and equipment. In 2016, there was no evidence of being involved in vote tallying. We assess, the joint intelligence agencies, that the 2016 influence campaign reflected Kremlin's recognition of the worldwide effects that mass disclosures of US government and other private data have achieved in recent years, and the value of orchestrating such disclosures to maximize the impact of compromising information. Very sophisticated set of cyber attacks, and with a purpose to essentially reduce confidence in the electoral process. As a result of that, there were indictments of a number of individuals and companies based in St. Petersburg, Russia. Effectively, these are what are called in the business of criminal justice as name and shame indictments. That is, you identify the people in the indictments you're indicting and the companies, but because you're never going to be able to extradite these people because we do not have an extradition treaty with Russia, and we do not have an evidence gathering treaty with Russia, they're going to be brought to justice in the United States. So these federal indictments are really what are called name and shame indictments. And this is often the problem with cyber attacks, is the state and federal criminal justice systems in this country really are not particularly good or useful at managing cyber attacks, because you're not able, for the reasons explained just previously, you're not able to get people into court, even though you can indict them. So a very sophisticated, a form of infrastructure cyber attack. So more specifically, cyber attacks happening on infrastructure. There's the Russian hacking of the 2016 election. In 2007, 12 years ago, the Baltic nation of Estonia was well on the way to earning its recently acquired nickname Estonia. It's a very sophisticated former Soviet republic that has really made a name for itself back in the 2000s for its embrace of e-technology. The country had used computer networks to automate and integrate nearly every aspect of its governance and society: banking, voting, parking, internet, phone companies. Skype was headquartered there. Was what's called a utopia of the burgeoning internet culture. Back in 2017, the then most widespread cyber attack in history, the nation's media websites, banking sites, government computers all suffered blackouts. Attackers targeted all of Estonia's major commercial banks, telecoms, media outlets, and some essential servers. They lasted 22 days and effectively crippled the nation's electronic infrastructure. They flooded the Estonian computer systems with the enormous number of requests. They effectively overloaded the systems and denied service to legitimate users. Virtually every Estonian citizen felt the impact, and there was rioting and social upheaval. One death, 150 people injured. So really a significant public infrastructure attack on government and private facilities that resulted in significant civil unrest. There's a report that came out 10 days ago, a little bit more than 10 days ago, 11 days ago, in a publication called The Hill. Xenotime, a group of hackers that has previously targeted oil and gas companies, has been targeting the U.S. electric grid in recent months, according to a new research released Friday by a cybersecurity group called Dragos. Dragos reports that Xenotime Group began probing the networks of electric utilities in the U.S. and Asia Pacific countries late last year. None of the probes resulted in the group gaining access to electric utility system, but these were persistent attempts and just very recent evidence that at least private hackers of unknown origin are trying to get at the U.S. Electric grid in recent months. This was a news article 10 days ago. So it's not like we're sitting by casually and as a government, or certainly at the private level, and letting these attacks happen without trying to do something about it. You know, private industry has been significantly ramping up its cybersecurity efforts all over the place. If any of you want to get into a new profession, get into the profession of cybersecurity, because there's big money being paid by private companies to people skilled in cybersecurity. And there are private companies who are making lots of money marketing themselves as private contractors to provide cybersecurity to private, and for that matter, public companies and even the government. I was talking with somebody last week who had a friend who worked for Raytheon, who was out in the desert of Arizona testing battery packs for when to be used when the electric grid went down. So private companies are working, aggressively about this. And again, you can go and get there's plenty of programs around the country that offer master's degrees and PhD degrees in cybersecurity, both at the technical level and the policy level. And this area of educational specialization has grown dramatically in the past particularly 5 years, the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a really rich area. So efforts are ongoing privately and publicly. The U.S. Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, the Department of Energy, among others, have significantly increased their efforts in this area. The problem is this. There was in 2015, there was a cyber attack that crippled the power distribution centers in the Ivano-Frankivsk region of Western Ukraine. And it preyed on systems back in 2015 that were surprisingly more secure than some in the US, since they were well segmented from the control center business networks with robust firewalls. Basically, what that is saying is the way the Ukrainian system was set up, probably, at least in 2015, offered more protection from this kind of attack than the then current ones in the United States. But nonetheless, the cyber attack still had a crippling effect on power distribution systems. So this is a real problem. Cyber attacks are occurring every day around the world. They're cyber attacks that are intended to be intentionally destructive, and they're intended to get at power grid systems. So let's look at what I have provocatively called the power grid apocalypse. I call it an apocalypse because I don't know that we've really begun to, as aggressively as we should, contemplate what a power grid shutdown of extended period of time over a significant geographical area would mean, an attack that was intended to be destructive. So let's take a look at that. The scope, power grid apocalypse is different than a natural disaster. What would happen, what people have talked about, there is a power grid attack that would shut down the entire eastern seaboard. There's really, for an extended period of time, that's different than a natural disaster, like a hurricane, flooding, an ice storm. I think our systems are in really good shape for emergency preparedness regarding natural disasters. Nothing's ever perfect, and every natural disaster is a little different and has its issues, but a region-wide intentional and systematic effort to disable power grids has the potential to be a longer-lasting event than an extreme weather event. It presents a more comprehensive disabling of infrastructure of all sorts. That's a quote from an article in Utility Dive. Now, for example, it would involve the loss of the provision of healthcare, home heating, air conditioning, schools, employment circumstances, public safety, the loss of ability to communicate by landline, the internet, cell phones, the complete disruption of a region's or a country's micro and macro financial systems, like electronic bill payment, electronic money transfers between individuals and businesses, as well as the complete shutdown of the banking system, the stock market, the Federal Reserve. Understand, I mean, it's not hard to appreciate, if you think about it, how comprehensive computers are in managing our infrastructure. And if the cyber attack is on the computers that run our power grid system and that run our financial system, they are and that run our healthcare, our hospitals. It's a remarkably pervasive problem. Both our gas flow system and our oil flow system are now managed when gas flows to one place versus another place, oil flows to one place versus to another place, electricity for that matter, the obvious. That flow is all managed by computers. So consider what a power grid attack that either temporarily disables computers, that's one kind of attack, your computers are down for 3 days, or the kind of attack that destroys the computer's functions and they need to be completely rebuilt. That's a really significant, heretofore unseen kind of attack. One of the issues is the duration of such an attack. Lloyd's of London did a modeling of the disabling of the power grid in 15 states on the eastern seaboard, including New York City and Washington, D.C., that suggests that such an event might leave 93 million customers without power. Evacuation on that scale is more than a bit challenging, if even possible. The modeling are suggested. And depending on the time of year, deep winter, particularly in the Northeast, or heat in the Southeast, could result in thousands of deaths over a longer period of time. Again, depending on the nature of the disabling or destruction of computer systems and power grid capability, such a power grid apocalypse could last for several months, which is a significant issue that we're starting to plan for, but is different than everything pretty much other than maybe a nuclear disaster. Intentionality. So it's not as if this is a hypothetical situation. I'm quoting March of 2019. This month, the US government revealed its concerns about Russian incursions into the operating systems of domestic electric power plants, and noted that the effort to disrupt date back to 2013. These attacks have the capability to bring down all or part of our electricity service. Such large-scale grid cyber attacks were foreseen. Department of Energy and DHS identified the grid's vulnerability to cyber attacks some time ago, and as recently as 2 years ago, called for new protective measures in this quadrennial energy review published by DOE back in January of 2017. So a little over about 2.5 years ago, we're calling for new protective measures given the prediction of the grid's vulnerability to cyber attacks. Excuse me. The study, which analyzed the entire US electricity system, noted that the key critical infrastructures underpinning the nation's economy and national security, transportation, water, finance, natural gas, oil, communications, IT, depend on a reliable electricity Uber network. And there have been intentional Russian incursions into those systems. Unpredictability. When a cyber attack on the power grid would occur is much more a function of international events than any natural disaster is. You know, we're getting better at predicting when there's a particularly destructive storm coming, be it a hurricane that might produce flooding or other kinds of destruction or grid disabling for a period of time, or independent of that, other kinds of flooding, or even an ice storm as we had several years ago in New Hampshire. Those, as a general matter, are much more predictable than an intentionally destructive power grid cyber attack. And it's a function of international relations, who this country is pissed off or who we as the US has pissed off, than it is about predictions about weather. And in that regard, it's more of a function of who controls the government in this system and in other countries. You know, historically, since the Vietnam War, the US president's ability to engage in what might be viewed as acts of war without getting approval of Congress has expanded greatly, and that debate continues. So that's an issue that is going to tell us more about when we might be subject to a retaliatory power grid attack than any kind of predictions that we're able to make with when the next hurricane is coming. For example, last Thursday, the US Cyber Command conducted online attacks against an Iranian intelligence group that American officials believed helped plan the attacks against oil tankers in recent weeks, according to people briefed on the operation. The intrusion occurred the same day President Trump called off a strike on Iranian targets like radar and missile batteries. But the online operation was allowed to go forward because it was intended to be below the threshold of armed conflict, using the same shadow techniques that Iran had deployed. Notice, this is the topic of the podcast I talked to you about earlier. So what kind of attack on Iran, cyber attack on Iran, is Iran going to treat like a declaration of war or an act of war, which under international law would allow them to respond proportionally to that attack? That's a completely unresolved question under international law, under all the guidelines produced by the UN, even under the U.S. Army's Law of War Manual, the Department of Defense Law of War Manual. So these are very difficult issues. And again, the point I make for the purpose of this lecture is the unpredictability of when a cyber attack on the power grid will occur. It's a function of international relationships or lack of quality international relationships that will tell you when such an occurrence might come. Or we just heard earlier this week, the United States is stepping up digital incursions into Russia's electric power grid in a warning to President Putin and a demonstration of how the Trump administration is using new authorities to deploy cyber tools more aggressively, current and former government officials say. Advocates of the more aggressive strategy said it was long overdue after years of public warnings from DHS and the FBI that Russia inserted malware that could sabotage American power plants, oil and gas pipelines, or water supplies in a future conflict. But it also carries significant risk of escalating the daily digital Cold War between Washington and Moscow. Excuse me, my phone keeps ringing. But now the American strategy has shifted, as America has become more offensive about this, more on the offense about this, and become much more aggressive on the theory that the best defense is a good offense. It's intended partly as a warning and partly to be poised to conduct cyber strikes if a major conflict broke out between Washington and Moscow. Now, here's the thing that is really both interesting and a little bit more than scary. Pentagon and intelligence officials described broad hesitation to go into detail with Mr. Trump about operations against Russia for concern over his reaction and the possibility that he might countermand it or discuss it with foreign officials, as he did in 2017 when he mentioned a sensitive operation in Syria to the Russian minister. Because a new law that was passed in the past 2 years defines action cyberspace as akin to traditional military activity on the ground, in the air, or at sea, no such briefing of the president would be necessary, they added. So now what we have going on is the U.S. military or the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI making decisions about what constitutes below the threshold of an act of war type cyber attacks on other countries without briefing the president in any detail whatsoever, which, depending on your views of this current president, is a good thing or a bad thing. But regardless of that, the military or DHS or the FBI making such consequential decisions on their own without Congress involved, without the president involved, brings a level of concern that most people are not aware of. So the moral of the story for those of you involved in the world of emergency preparedness is simple: prepare. Think about this kind of disaster and problem as one that is several orders of magnitude different from the more classic types of disaster that we have been thinking about so far in the world of emergency preparedness. I think, there's already conversations about it. I'm aware of that, but I really think at a federal, state, and county level and a regional level, we need to coordinate and prepare much more significantly for what this might entail and the problems that we might run into that are different than the other kinds of preparedness that we already have in place. So that's the substance of what I have to offer. Again, here are the links I talked about. More than willing to field any questions. If anybody has any questions, you can write them up in your chat, and Sarah will relay them to me.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't see any questions in the chat right now. So feel free to either type them into the chat section, or if you want to take yourself off of mute and just ask your question to the group, you're welcome to do that as well at this time. All right, I don't see anyone typing, so I will assume that there aren't any questions, and then we will wrap it up.
Thank you all for signing on and listening in. Feel free to contact me if you have questions you want to ask in a more private context. My email is here, as is my phone number. Thank you all.
Thank you.